Welcome to another edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. Hello, it's Rick and Bubba, professors handing out diplomas in common sense. That now has become a superpower. And today, Bubba, Chris Skates is our guest, former speechwriter and policy advisor for 2 administrations, a chemist for 30 years. He has authored 4 novels, over 300 articles and short stories. And he is kind of a throwback. He's from Georgia. He's like us, good old Southern boy, knows how to tell a good story, knows how to spin a yarn, and he joins us now. Chris, welcome to Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. How are you?
Good. Thank you guys for having me.
Well, I think we should say welcome back.
Welcome
right?
back, yeah. So we were talking about, you actually were on the show, the big show, the weekly show, the Rick and Bubba show, when you were with the Ted Cruz campaign, right?
Correct. I was a daily listener to you guys at the time and a fan. And I was driving in one day and heard you, Bubba actually started talking about the fact that Trump had just announced his candidacy and just said a lot of good things about Trump. And so being a Cruz guy, I had to take exception with a few things. And so I called in and you guys put me on, and we actually got along so well. You kept me through a commercial break, so I was honored. And ironically, later I would end up in the Trump administration.
Well, and the other irony of that is I was a Ted Cruz guy till right down at the end. So, and kind of funny, my daughter's roommate works for Ted Cruz in D.C. So,
oh wow, okay.
So we're all intermingled here.
Yeah.
I was a Ben Carson guy till I got to the point that the things he said were really good, but nobody could hear him.
Whispering Ben.
Yeah, so anyway, but we all ended up in the Trump camp eventually, didn't we?
We sure did. And I was honored to work for the president and be in a couple of meetings with him and see him really lead. There's no doubt about it. When President Trump walks into a conference room, who's running the meeting? It was really a great experience.
Well, if you were with him now, and I know we got other things to talk about, but this is intriguing because he's running again, and all the attempts to destroy him and put him in jail and all of that. So he did get beat head-to-head against Biden. I know there's a lot of controversy around voter integrity and the pandemic and all the things we allowed that we normally don't. I understand all that. But we can't ignore, and Bubba's mentioned this on the big show many times, he did not test well with women from suburbia. It's almost like they were embarrassed to say they supported him because they saw him as being mean, that the name calling and all of that, his social media presence and him being a little reckless there bothered them.
And they supported him the first time around.
So if you were in his ear, now he doesn't come across to me, Chris, as being very coachable, which I know sometimes serves him well, but at times it's a detriment. What would you suggest in this campaign?
He can unify the country. He is very good at unifying.
Yeah.
But I almost want to speak to the perception as much as the man. So before President Trump, I was with Governor Matt Bevin of Kentucky for 4 years and worked very closely with him. They're actually very similar personalities. Governor Bevin's more devoutly Christian than President Trump, probably. A lot more polite. But they're both type A, self-made men. Trump did inherit a business, but he grew it exponentially from what it was when he inherited it. Governor Bevin started with nothing and became very, very successful. And they have trusted their gut their entire career. So when people would tell me, especially with Governor Bevin, who I work much more closely with, you need to tell him to not say this, or you need to tell him to keep his mouth shut. And I tell people that's never going to happen. If you want a guy who is willing to take on the dragon, and as bad as you guys may think Washington, D.C. is, it's much, much worse behind the scenes. If you want somebody that's willing to battle that, you're not going to have a nice guy. You're not going to have Mr. Polite. That's one of the things that Democrat candidates are notorious for. They're great at pretending to be nice when they're really quite sinister. And too many voters are enamored with fake nice.
That's so true. Very, very true. And it kind of goes back to what I think you're right. I think there needs to be a better job of educating the voters that this Washington cesspool I'm so sorry. I know we wish it would be, but it is a dirty job, and you got to find a person that the dirty job part of it doesn't intimidate them.
Right. You've got to throw some uppercuts. And another thing that both gentlemen had an issue with, and all presidents run into this. President Reagan ran into this. I've been really thrilled to get to be friends with several people from the Reagan administration and have talked about a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. When you first get in office, and even Reagan, even though he had been a governor, he was a bit of an outsider to DC. You have so many people in your face trying to get you to hire this guy. Oh, this guy would be great for secretary of this. This guy would be great for secretary of that. And it's, for instance, with Kentucky governor, you have to hire 1,000 people in 30 days. From the time you're elected to the time you are responsible for governing the state is 30 days. You're going to whiff on some of those, and you're going to get some bad advice. And what a lot of people don't realize is the big time players in DC and in state capitals, they know how to saddle up beside you and tell you everything you want to hear. They speak your language just fine. They're not sincere about any of it, but they tell you what you want to hear. You think they're an ally, and you need allies because you're brand new in this, and you're not drinking from a fire hose. You're drinking from Niagara Falls.
Wow.
So you end up with some enemies in the camp who are put there on purpose to undermine your administration. I know this for a fact. I could name names. President Trump was a victim of that. But it's very difficult when you're a political outsider to avoid that because you've got so many people to hire in such a short period of time, and you have to seek advice from people that you think are your allies. Both men learned, okay, these guys aren't my allies. I'm going to fire the you-know-what out of them in the second term, but they never got their second term.
You know, in our dealings with President Trump, personally, he always did what he said he was going to do.
Yes.
Even maybe to his detriment once he said he was going to do it. But, you know, a lot of times, and speaking of that, do you think that, again, that's a massive number of people to hire. And I don't know how in the world anybody can filter through that. You have to have a lot of help, and you have to trust that help.
You have a transition team.
Yeah.
And in some cases, President Trump didn't listen to a couple of key members of his transition team that were telling him the right thing. But you've got, on a presidential transition team, you've probably got 30, 40 people, and you think you can trust all of them, and you can't. And it takes you a while to figure out who's really telling you the right stuff. I think he's figured it out now. That's why I'm actually looking forward to, if he can be reelected, he's learned a lot.
Well, that was the question really I was wanting to get to, because he blew a lot of people out of there, called them losers, all this stuff, but he was the one that originally hired them. I think that was maybe one of the downfalls that he may have had, some of the people he picked up to begin with.
Absolutely. The first two chiefs of staff were a borderline disaster.
Yeah, don't you think though, if we could just get the communication of what you just did, because I think the American people are very forgiving if you own it, and I think that there needs to be a clear communication of what you just said. When you take over as president, especially as an outsider, you have so many people that you have got to hire. You're going to make some mistakes, and just say, so that did happen, but let me tell you what separates me from others. I correct the mistakes. If I had a bad hire and I didn't listen, or I listened to the wrong person, and the person showed, because he really values loyalty, and I did not find this person to be trustworthy. I found them to be a detriment to the country, to my administration, so I will remove them. I think the American people go, yeah, I guess if I was in your position, I could see that. I could make a mistake on a few hires, but you're owning it and then you're correcting it. And I think that is an important message.
I do hope he'll do that. And I know two of his top advisors very well, and I have worked with them, and they're excellent. Sometimes he goes off script. So hopefully he won't go off script as much, and he'll stay on message, and he'll communicate the message that you just described.
Do you, Chris, do you believe, and I've always believed this, that a large part of the economy, there's nuts and bolts to it, no doubt, but a large part of it is perception. And right now, when Biden went in, he gave the perception of, we're going to shut this down, shut this down, shut this down. And then, obviously, from 8th grade, we know more money than they are goods, which was pushed into the economy during COVID. was a formula for inflation, and we got it. It played out just like it should. But do you think even Trump being reelected, when he goes in and says, we're going to open these pipelines up, we're going to be self-sufficient, that will have even a bigger swing in our economy than even what the actual nuts and bolts of doing that would do?
Yes, I think so. And I'm glad you said pipelines. Energy is my main area of expertise. And President Trump was by far the best energy president of my lifetime. That's where I served. I was at DOE headquarters, and he was doing some outstanding. He was doing some things in the energy space that I had been hoping for and praying for 30 years. And he was really just getting started. He came to DOE headquarters and he made a very important speech that was barely covered by the media because they don't like to cover the positive things he did. And he said, I don't want America to be energy independent. I want America to be energy dominant. I want America to be a net exporter of energy. In January of 2020, we achieved that goal. And President Biden turned off the faucet almost as soon as he got in office.
Yeah, I think sometimes the next guy coming in will just, as a knee-jerk reaction, we're going to redo everything or undo everything my predecessor did. And that's not always the best thing to do right out of the gate. Maybe you should look at it and decide if it's working or not.
It certainly wasn't the right thing to do this time, and I think it was very premeditated. We could have a whole separate conversation about where I think the energy culture is over the past 10 years. It's not good.
Do you think, Chris, let me ask you this while we're on this topic to dive in. I know the long-term strategic thought of the United States for decades was, we're not going to drill all of our oil. We'll let the rest of the world drill and use theirs up, and then we'll have some when nobody else does long term. Or at least it looked like that's what our goal was. But in the meantime, we made so many countries in the Middle East rich that now they are competitors of ours militarily and a lot of other ways that we basically let them fund their way into being a threat to a superpower.
Yeah, Sarah Palin was mocked a lot when she said drill, baby, drill, but she was exactly right. And now we know that there's infinitely more oil reserves, especially with shale oil and fracking, than we thought we had. And the other thing, hey, I'm from Kentucky. I'm from a coal state. We sit on the richest coal reserves in the world. We should be doing coal gasification, turning coal into gasoline. And we're not doing any of that because of the hysteria over man-caused climate change. The climate people have really achieved their goal, which is they've about broken the coal industry, because now the coal industry has been on the ropes for so long, we're losing the expertise to mine coal. The guys that really knew how to go underground and get coal are all my age and have bad knees and bad backs. And the 20-somethings aren't going underground and mining coal. They're not going to do that work.
Well, we'll talk more about oil when we come back.
Yeah, so we'll take a break. We'll be back. Chris Skates is our guest. He's also got a brand new novel out we'll cover before we're done with this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast.
This is the Rick and Bubba Show. Watch more at blazetv.com/Rick and Bubba.
Rick and Bubba, Rick and Bubba.
Chris Skates is our guest. He is a former speechwriter and policy advisor for 2 administrations, even worked inside the Trump administration, was with Ted Cruz on his attempt to be the nominee, but then it did end up working some with Trump, and can speak to Washington in a way with quite a bit of expertise. And we'll get to the new novel, which is something else he's been doing. But you had one more comment.
Yeah, well, just a couple. Yep. Chris, I find it so disingenuous of the Biden administration. And, and they've got a lot of these kids that think that, a barrel of oil is the end of the world. But half of that barrel goes to making plastics. And those plastics are going to be required if you're going to have battery cars or hydrogen cars or whatever, not to mention how it's used in medical and everything else. I mean, we're never going to be off of oil. We're going to have to drill. And I think they're just real disingenuous about that.
I do too. And I think we're making a terrible tactical error to not use our God-given fossil fuel resources, coal and oil.
Yeah, the it's all sold under the environmental thing, and you can have a discussion with a lot of these kids now. They think CO2 is a poison.
Right, exactly. They have had a very effective propaganda campaign about CO2, and I was one of the ones that was pushing back. I published a number of white papers and columns all over the country talking about the fraud of man-caused climate change, but I lost. There was a handful of us that were skeptical of it and were trying to speak to the science from the skeptical side, and there were legions of the other side, and they had all the big microphones.
Yeah, now you know how those who tried to say once the virus mutates, the vaccine is not going to help you at all, and also talked about some of the concerns about some of the vaccines. Even though these people had incredible expertise and even part of the research that developed them, they were silenced if they weren't going to say the right thing and get in line. And the climate change movement has certainly done that exact same strategy to take voices that say, well, I take issue with the hypothesis that it's man-made climate change. Certainly the climate has changed throughout Earth's existence, but man-made has yet to be proven. But see, that's not the acceptable narrative, so you don't get to say that.
Exactly. And you made a very strong and accurate parallel with the COVID vaccine. We ought to do a whole other episode someday on the scientific method and the COVID vaccine and man-caused climate change, but we go down that rabbit trail. We'll be on here for 3 hours.
Well, we've said this, on our show one time, Chris, remember this, Bubba? Bubba and I began to say we are abandoning the scientific method, and we had a young person call up and say, scientific method, what is that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had no idea.
Yeah, we're not even teaching it anymore. So if I don't learn something, then I never know when it's been violated.
Well, we got so many holidays and special events and days we're saluting this and that. We can't hardly get any school teaching done. Chris, a little bit in the weeds here, but since you're an expert on this, I can't let you pass. I, early on in this, thought that if we are going to get away from gasoline the way we use it now, and we're just hell-bent on doing that hydrogen would be the most logical step as far as the way that we distribute gas, the way we do this. It kind of went away a little bit. Batteries took over. Hydrogen's making another run now. I've seen 2 or 3 presentations on that. Tell it, is there any hope in the hydrogen, or is that just another rabbit hole?
Absolutely. And you're right. That's the 2 big, if we're determined to get away from fossil fuels, the 2 big moves we can make that will really be strong will be hydrogen and nuclear power for electricity generation. There's some really good, exciting new nuclear reactor designs out there. And I started my career on a nuclear reactor. I did a refueling outage when I was 24 years old. But yeah, I worked in the office where we were working on the hydrogen issue, and I'm very familiar with it. And yeah, there's a bright future there. Now, of course, everybody remembers the Hindenburg. So some of the hydrogen turbines that they're working with, they have had a couple of what we call in the industry puffs.
Yeah.
And so we've got to remedy that, but there's a lot of money being poured into it, and I do have high hopes for it.
So we have so many conversations, Chris.
We could talk 2 hours with you, Chris, about energy.
Well, just like the day he called the show about Ted Cruz, and he got back in the Tonight Show. If Carson asked you over to over to the couch, that was big. And on our show, it's if we hold you through the break.
Yeah.
And so Chris, we'll have to have another podcast with you for sure. I was
honored that you guys held me that day.
Yeah. Well, we want to talk about the other thing that you have apparently are gifted at, and that's writing novels. You have one called Moonshine Over Georgia. Tell us a little bit about your grandfather, because I know he was the inspiration for this novel. He was devout in his Christian faith, and with the childhood experience that he had. He got an unapologetic crusade going against moonshiners and alcoholism and the damage it was doing in his community. And tell us a little bit about this great man and how this inspired this novel.
Yeah, thank you. So I was 12, and he and I were so close. I've never had another male figure in my life like him. We did everything together. We liked the same things. He taught me hunting. He was better at all of it than I was, much better. But I just was in love with him. And so I spent summers with him. And we were sitting there one summer day. We'd been working out in the garden, and we would always come in, and my grandmother would fix one of those great Southern lunches. And then we would sit there and watch the Andy Griffith Show. So we're watching Andy Griffith, which was one of his favorite shows. And Rafe Hollister comes on the screen. Oh, yeah. Rafe Hollister was a great tenor singer. He was in about 5 or 6 episodes, but he was also the Mayberry area moonshiner. So they're doing some comedy around moonshine, and Otis is going to buy this moonshine. And all of a sudden, my grandfather began to cry. And he was very irritated, and he reached up and he turned off the TV real abruptly. And I said, I had never seen him cry. I said, Pop, what's the matter? And he said, it wasn't like that, boy. There was nothing funny about the moonshine business. Mm. He said, you think you've heard a little child cry? He said, wait till you drag their daddy out of his own vomit and he's sick off a toxic moonshine, and you take him home to some little shanty. He said, you can't even identify with how poor people were back then. And his children are running around in the yard at 1 o'clock in the morning with no clothes on, and they haven't eaten in 2 days. And daddy just spent all the money they've got on bad moonshine, and now he's going to be sick for a week and not able to work. He said, that's when you've heard a little child cry.
Ooh.
My grandfather grew up with 5 sisters in a single-parent home. He was the only boy, and he was basically turned loose at 6 years old to go find some meat. And he hunted rabbit and quail and ducks, and he fished and gator, and they ate gator tail. He grew up in the North Florida swamps, and he was just turned loose. And he developed incredible shooting skills. He was an outstanding navigator in the deep woods. And when he got grown, he first tried to play baseball. He played in the Florida Grapefruit League. But when he got a little older, he found out they were paying guys to go find moonshine stills. Well, he realized that he had a skill set that made him uniquely qualified to be a really good revenue agent. And he saw the alcoholism that was infecting his community. Moonshine was the methamphetamine or the fentanyl of that day and age. It was a multi-million-dollar business. And so he signed up for it to be a revenue agent, and he was extremely good at it. When I was researching this book, I was able to find a 93-year-old moonshiner that my grandfather arrested in 1946 in a nursing home in Panama City Beach, Florida.
No way.
And he was sharp as a tack. His memory was great. And he was a gold mine of information about my grandfather. And he told me, your grandfather was fearless. He was relentless, but he was also fair. And that was really great to hear coming from one of the guys that he arrested. Ultimately, my grandfather got involved in one of the most infamous murder cases in Georgia history, the murder of Wilson Turner by John Wallace, which was made into a motion picture, ironically starring Andy Griffith as the killer.
No.
It was the only ever played a killer. And Johnny Cash is the sheriff, called Murder in Coweta County. So my book halfway covers that murder investigation, which my grandfather was intimately involved in, but tells a completely new perspective on it. There's details of that case that only my grandfather knew, and he only told me. But the other half of the book is about the Upson County liquor gang case, for which my grandfather was commended by the governor of Georgia, of how he rounded up the Upson County liquor gang. And your listeners will find it a fascinating book. I'm really getting a lot of 5-star reviews. But you said something the other day, Rick, that really resonated with me. You said, I was watching your episode when you guys announced this was going to be your last year. And you said that you believed that radio was your calling. Stamping out moonshine stills was my grandfather's calling. And this book, yeah, it's about a murder in 1946. Yes, it's about a big liquor case in 1946 that also happened that year. But more than anything, it's a book about calling and what we can do as individuals. My calling is to be a writer. You've seen my bio. I was working shift at a power plant, and I educated myself, and I kept writing, and I kept getting rejected, and I kept writing, and I ultimately ended up writing a speech for the President of the United States.
Wow.
So my calling is to write and to try to communicate Christian virtue through literature. And another thing I sought to do with this book, and I'm so thrilled that I've succeeded at it, is 85% of all book buyers are women. 85% of the people that go into bookstores are female. Our men have stopped reading good fiction. And part of that, I think, is because fiction has become so feminine oriented.
Yep.
So I wanted to write a book that men would love. And guys, I've had at least 200 messages through Facebook. Guys have reached out to me in all different venues on my social media. And they'll say something very similar to this. I had not read a novel in 25 years. I read yours in 2 days.
Yep.
One of the most gratifying things that happened was I got a call about 3 weeks ago from a retired Green Beret colonel. And I had given him a book. He came to my father's funeral. I lost my father and my mother in January. And I gave him a book just on a lark. And he called me about 3 weeks later and he said, "Sir, I read the book in one sitting and I've never done that before in my life."
Wow.
And it just gives me chill bumps because men need to see men characters who are strong. And how about this? How about a law officer who's not a womanizer, who's not an alcoholic, who's not on his last leg, who's not just really as bad as the bad guys? How about a law officer that loved his family, loved his community, and was willing to lay down his life for it? That's what my story is about.
We'll come back. We'll finish our conversation with Chris Skates. The book is called Moonshine Over Georgia. When Rick and Bubba University, the podcast continues. Raycon earbuds. Some of you, I mean, right now, you hear Bubba and I talking on Raycon earbuds because so many people in our audience have them. Listen to some of the things that people are saying. Hey, it's the same audio quality I expect from the big guys, but at half the price. If you like the sound of that testimonial, you need to go ahead and pull the trigger on a pair of Raycons. Even if you're not even thinking about, well, I don't know if I was in the market to buy another pair, why not get some maybe as a gift? They're so affordable, you can get another pair. How about Mother's Day coming up for mom? So they've just offered an upgraded model of the best-selling everyday earbuds. It's the perfect time to check these out. You also get active noise cancellation. You get the multi-point connectivity that lets you pair with two devices at one time. Available. I like the cool colors, Bubba. You mentioned that. They look cool.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they look cool.
They just look neat.
Yeah, they really look cool. So they've got the optimized gel tips. That means they fit snug in the ear. 3 customizable sound styles. Also, if the type of music you're listening to, you go to that profile. There's never been a better time than right now, and they offer a 30-day happiness guarantee. So what in the world are you waiting on? Go ahead and get yours now. Get in the loop. BuyRaycon.com/RickBubbaPod. Put all that together. BuyRaycon.com/RickBubbaPod. Get 20% off your Raycon order plus free shipping. 20% off and free shipping at BuyRaycon.com/RickBubbaPod. Chris Skates is our guest. He has been a speechwriter for presidents. He has written novels. His latest, Moonshine Over Georgia. And Chris, you mentioned going to the break. I'm seeing some of these testimonials, and there's all sorts of men. I think men, a lot of times we go, well, men don't like to read, and I've said that before. The other day I was talking, and my wife was asking me. She said, "Well, I haven't seen you, reading anything lately." And you know what I said? And now you've answered it too. I said, "No, I love to read if it's any good." I mean, if I don't read just for the sake of reading. I mean, why should I read it? But I think you hit on something going to the break. I don't think we're going to have much luck petitioning Hollywood, our TV and entertainment to say you got to stop emasculating men. You've got to stop portraying men as being stupid, self-involved, not paying attention, apathetic, passive, and they're actually a detriment to everyone. And thank goodness for mom, because without her, everything would fall apart. And our mothers are important. I mean, some of the most influential people in our lives. A lot of times, I know for me, my mother and my grandmother and my wife are incredibly influential in my life. But it's almost like the world would be better if we didn't have men. There was a time when we thought men were the answer to the problems. Now we think that if we eradicated men, that they are the problem. And I think we're not going to really get movies and TV shows to do it. So you made a good point. Why not books?
Yeah. And you really hit on something, because you should, the things that I had to go through to get this book published, it took me years because I could not get publishers to understand the hunger for a book like this. And my reviews on Amazon are a testimonial to it. People are just eating it up. And one of the things I was so excited to be on your show is your audience and my target market are identical.
Yeah.
And I'm actually doing an event here in Georgia. I'm from Kentucky, but I traveled to Georgia last night. I'm doing the Cotton Fair in Gay, Georgia. And the folks that will attend that, the people that listen to your show are loving this book. And I said it's really aimed at men, and it kind of is. But I've had a broad spectrum of women readers. I've had 18-year-old young women reach out to me with just glowing testimonials. I've had a 90-year-old woman hug my neck. She came to a book signing, had already read the book, and had a broken leg, guys, and had her grandsons carry her in so she could hug my neck because she thought so much of the book. And that was one of the highlights of my writing career, to get a hug from her.
But I think I think the important. Go ahead, finish that, and I'll finish that up. Go ahead.
The other thing you mentioned is the way Hollywood and even some fiction is now. You guys may be familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian writer who wrote very eloquently about literature and what literature can do to elevate a culture. Some of our most popular novelists, and I want to name names, but I'm not going to, try to top themselves every time they write a book. So if they had a really psychopathic villain with really graphic violence in their book, the next one they make it even worse.
Right.
And Solzhenitsyn called that soul staining. When you put that, especially as a Christian person or a person of faith, when you put that into your brain and into your mind, that's not edifying. So my books, they do have violence in them. They're not. One of the mistakes that Christian fiction made years ago was everything was vanilla pudding. Everybody sang Kumbaya at the end and got saved. And that's not real life either. So I do have violence, but I'm not so graphic that you feel dirty after having read it. When people read my book, they leave with a very positive feeling, a positive outlook. They've experienced courage, they've experienced virtue, they've experienced redemption in the stories, and that's what I'm most proud of.
Well, and you, that was the point. Bubba and I talk about this a lot, and you just hit on it. As men who are followers of Christ, I think sometimes even in the Christian culture, and especially the Western church, we want to guilt people into supporting something, but it has no merit. We don't do a very good job. And so we talk about that all the time. And one of the things I believe, like you said, about the novels and men not reading, it's kind of the same thing that we took on. We started doing, themanchurch.com, is the church keeps trying to, point their fingers and wag their fingers at men, saying you're not engaged, but they never look back at themselves and ask the question, the way we're presenting church and the way we're attempting to reach and disciple men, is it possible we're the problem? The men would respond.
Can't be us.
Yeah, the men would respond if we actually would speak to them like God made them. As opposed to building the church around catering to women and children and wondering why men are disinterested and wander around the parking lot and can't wait for this to be over. But if you start talking to men like men, strangely, you find them getting engaged in curriculum and getting engaged in church when you start talking to them the way God made them. And I think you just hit on it. That's been the problem with men drifting away from reading, is that just like all the other different modes of entertainment or education out there, they mainly cater to women and children and wonder why men don't have any interest in it.
Exactly. Do you guys have time for a quick humorous story?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Grandfather's real career.
Yeah.
Another guy that I found during my research was a revenue agent. I only knew that he was a revenue agent in the same region of Georgia in the same general time period. I didn't know if he would know my grandfather or not. It was very much a God thing, because when I got the gentleman on the phone, he was 86, also very clear-minded. I said, "Did you know Agent C.E. Miller?" He said, "Son, I didn't just know your grandfather. He was my training officer."
Okay, I have to stop you right here, because we are going to take a break. I want to hear this story. First of all, Bubba and I both are intrigued. I'd like to know how these men live their lives that are so sharp in their late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
I'd like for you to research these men. Why are they so sharp? But
were they taking a swig of that moonshine or what?
We'll come back. We'll finish this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast.
This is the Rick and Bubba Show. Watch more at blazetv.com/Rick and Bubba.
Rick and Bubba, Rick and Bubba.
Chris Skates is our guest. So, Chris, tell us the story about this 86-year-old you met.
So he was a revenue agent. He said, "Your grandfather trained me." And he said, "When I hired into the revenue service, your grandfather was like a legend." And so I was so intimidated to go on my first raid with me. And your grandfather set it all up so I could learn. And he took me to a still that he deliberately picked a small one that there were only 3 men working so the 2 of us could handle it. And he said, we had to hide in a thicket and watch the guy start the fire, get the boiler going. We could not make a criminal case until we saw moonshine coming out of what's called the money piece or the spout.
Right.
So we did that. And he said, your grandfather whispered to me and he said, all right, son, I'm going to give the signal. He said, when I do, he said, you see that man on the right? And he said, my heart was beating out of my chest. And I nodded, yes, sir. And he said, that's your man. He said, I'm going to take care of the other 2. And he said, your grandfather had an interesting habit. Now, this is something my grandfather had told me already, but it was really cool to hear it from another living witness. He said he would never say, this is a raid, boys. He had kind of a trademark. He would quote a Bible verse.
Oh, wow.
So he'd say, be ye not drunk with wine, boys. And everybody would take off running. So my guy took off and jumped into a mature stand of corn and over a barbed wire fence. And he said, I looked down through the corn and I could see his hat bouncing and he was moving. And the way his hat was bouncing through the corn, I realized he was on a horse. He had a horse tied up to that fence.
Oh, wow.
So he said, I didn't even try to chase him. I just went back to the still site and there was a stump there and I sat down on the stump and waited. He said, about 20 minutes, here came your grandpa. He had both his guys in handcuffs. He said, your grandpa pushed his hat back on his head and he scowled at me. He said, son, where's the man I told you to chase? And I said, well, sir, he got away on his horse. Your grandpa put his boot up on the stump and leaned down real close to me. He said, why do you think he had a horse? He said, well, sir, I could see how his hat was bouncing and how fast he was moving. I knew he had to be on a horse. He said, your grandpa squeezed my shoulder and he said, son, the man don't even own a horse. You know what he does have? A wooden leg. He said, I gave you a one-legged man to chase because I thought you could catch him. And he said, your grandpa rode me about that for 6 weeks. And he said, he knew where the guy lived and he went and waited for him in his house and we arrested him and he pulled his overalls leg up. He said, he showed me he had a wooden leg.
Let me tell you what, that guy might have had a wooden leg, but it sounds like he was digging.
Yeah.
He was getting all out of it he could.
Yeah.
He may have had splinters after that.
Yeah, you really talk about this with this book, Moonshine Over Georgia. This is also one of these things you look back, and we say this all the time, Bubba, and I say this about our dads. You're saying about your granddad. I think people are afraid we don't make men like this anymore.
I know. You wonder. You really wonder. If I get to come back, I'll tell you about when I was in D.C., I collapsed one day and found out that I had acute lymphoblastic leukemia.
Ooh.
The most deadly form of leukemia in the world, only a 2% survival rate.
Wow.
And I had to fight harder than I've ever fought in my life to beat that foe. And I'm in remission 3 years now. I'm doing very well.
Praise God.
But the toughness that my dad and my grandfather instilled in me saved my life there, because I would not have been able to win that brutal battle if I hadn't been prepared for it earlier in life. And what's the saying? Hard men make good times.
Yeah.
Good times make soft men. Something like that.
Yeah, and then
soft times good times make soft men, and it rotate. It goes in a circle.
Soft men make bad times, and then hard men have to come back and clean it up again.
Yeah,
and
something like that.
We need some hard men. Before we go, I do want to mention that your listeners can get my book on Amazon.com. Your audio guys, I produced and directed an audiobook. I hired a great voice actor named Gary Barboza. One of the most fun, creative endeavors I've ever done. So you can get audio if you want to listen to it in your car. Gary does a great job narrating in my grandfather's voice. You can get paperback or Kindle on Amazon.
Oh, cool. So it's not just you reading it, because I always go back and forth. Would I prefer to hear the author? But you're saying this guy is so good, you almost get to take on, this is what your grandfather would have sounded like?
Exactly. In fact, he encouraged me to do it myself, and he coached me. So I got into the studio and I did 2 or 3 chapters, and he said, listen, you do 2 chapters and I'll do the same 2 chapters and you can see which one you like the best. The guy was a heck of a lot better than me.
Right.
So I have actually listened to it 3 times, guys, because it's so emotional for me. And I told you, I lost my mother in January. Sadly, she had dementia for the last couple of years of her life and had lost a lot of her memory and couldn't read a book and just retain it. But she listened to the audiobook and her nurse was playing it for her, and she got to chapter 2 and she was kind of really not ambulatory at the time, but all of a sudden she sat up in bed and she said, "Hey, that's my daddy talking."
Oh, wow.
So words that I had written on behalf of my grandfather to try to capture his what writers call voice, and that Gary spoke, my mother, who had dementia, recognized as her own father.
Yeah, my dad just died of Alzheimer's. Bubba's mother passed a few years ago, or several years ago now, from the same thing, and it was sad. I remember my dad; he loved to read Louis L'Amour. I mean,
Yeah, I love Louis.
yeah, Dad's got the latest Western, and he'd be reading it, and that was one of the sad things that horrible disease brought on is he lost the ability to be able to sit down and read, and so audio is really good. And as a matter of fact, I see that the audio sample, if you go to your Amazon page, we can all listen to that. You've got a sample for free there.
Yes, and that sample is of a meeting that it's very historically accurate scene. Wallace, the killer, wrote my grandfather a handwritten note. I saw it when I was a boy. He showed it to me. I can't find it now. But it said, "Agent Miller, it is urgent that we speak. Meet me at my barn at midnight. Come alone." And my grandfather went to that meeting, and that's why my cover is designed the way it is. That cover is depicting the midnight meeting with the killer, John Wallace, at his barn. And that kicks off my book. That's chapter 4 of my book, and the whole story builds from that. And what happened in that meeting, not only did my grandfather tell me great detail about it, but during my research, I found a letter that John Wallace wrote. I have a copy of it, and he talks about the meeting in detail and confirms everything my grandfather said.
Chris, let me ask you this: the group that your granddad served with, did they lose any officers in this?
I don't know. They did have, sadly, revenue agents were very subject to corruption because my grandfather's annual salary at the peak of his career was $2,400 a year. And what they did allow them to do is if they confiscated materials at a moonshine still, they were allowed to keep that and sell it to supplement their salary. Well, that led to a lot of guys planting moonshine on people so that they could confiscate their property. The other thing was they had such a low salary, moonshiners were often making that amount in a week. So they would hand $500 to a revenue agent and say, "Hey, how about you call in sick for about 3 or 4 days?" So they didn't have to really commit a crime. They just had to do something unethical. And that was one of the most rewarding things when I spoke to the old moonshiner, the 93-year-old. My grandfather had always told me that he never took a bribe. And obviously you want to believe your grandfather.
Yeah.
But that moonshiner told me, he said, "We were able to bribe most of the revenue agents, but your grandfather never took a dime." And that was really uplifting to hear that from one of the, back then, bad guys.
All right.
Yeah, and you're right on this. Your grandfather's right. We tend to romanticize sin, and it coming from a place of conviction, he saw the evil of it all, and had a righteous call to it. He felt like he should eradicate that evil as a man of God from his community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He was really impacted by the kids that he saw. My mother, when I was researching the book, my mother was still healthy. And she told me that there were many nights that he would come home and just turn a chair into the corner and cry about something he'd seen a child going through. And when that day, he told me that after we watched Andy Griffith's show, when he really finally broke down, he said, he said about 4 times in a row, "I couldn't help them all. I couldn't help them all. I couldn't help them all." And my grandmother, they bickered constantly by then. They'd been married 68 years. But that day she pushed an ottoman over to him and took his hands and just sat there and held his hands. It was really, really moving. And he was very moved by the kids. And God help you if you harmed a child and he found out about it.
Chris, I'll have to tell you, one of our science fairs when I was in elementary school, I was going to build a still. And after it was initially approved, as I got the project going, it was shut down by school officials. And sadly, we had some family expertise in that. But
Right.
If I'd have just known that we could have been making alcohol for cars, ethanol, I could have sold it as that.
Yeah, you could have. Chris,
Sorry,
thank you.
My phone's ringing here. I apologize.
That's all right.
fine.
Hey, Chris, thank you for the time that you've given us today, and And this has been a fascinating conversation. The book is doing great. If you want to get your copy, Moonshine Over Georgia, on Amazon, you can actually go get the free audio sample too. It's available in audio or in print.
Come by and see us sometime.
Yeah, Chris, this won't be the last time.
I'd love to be in
We'd
the
love
studio
to
with
talk
you guys.
energy with you. Our audience eats that up. It's good stuff.
Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah,
And
I'd be glad to.
Chris Skates, our guest today. Moonshine Over Georgia is the novel on this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. Thank you for joining us. Chris, thank you for being our guest, and we'll talk to you on the next edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast.